Welcome to Best Practice, a show where we interview leaders in the building industry to unpack the tools, tactics, strategies that they use to run great organizations. Today, my colleague at Monograph, Chris Morgan, and myself are very pleased to welcome Alloy Development Director of Construction, Alexandra Militano, to talk about how to build as an architect-led developer in, of all places, New York City. Ali directs the construction of projects at Alloy Development, where she oversees on-site execution and construction administration. She has a master's in real estate from NYU and also a bachelor's of architecture from Virginia Tech. Ali has also worked for 8 years in construction management at Structure Tone in New York before her current role. So really intense. So that's really exciting to basically be able to see mostly the entire life cycle of a project up to even beyond delivery. So if you're not familiar with Alloy Development, this firm is a hybrid architect developer model that's based in predominantly Brooklyn, where they work on making the city more beautiful, sustainable, and equitable. They have a lot of really beautiful projects there. They question existing practices and propose new ways to benefit the social and built environment. So as a developer, they really differentiate themselves by focusing on very local, like on communities themselves. They've developed over 1.6 billion in work, which is pretty impressive, with products along the High Line and also several in Dumbo. They use great architecture and thoughtful development to positively impact our built environment. Special thanks to Dan Nisley, one of our team members here at Monograph, who connected us with Ali. So, Ali, thank you so much for joining us. That was a kind of a mouthful of an intro, but I think we can kind of get into the nitty gritty. So I think to start, it would be great to understand a little bit more about, what sets Alloy apart, and kind of we can then dive a bit more about you and how you fit into Alloy.
Right. So I think what sets Alloy apart is, like you said, we are a development firm who does all of the architecture for our own developments. So it's not an architecture firm that we provide services to other developers. It's just all in-house, vertically integrated. So I think what sets us apart from other real estate developers is that unfortunately, most developers are focused on the bottom line. And then the unfortunate thing for architects is that they care deeply about the design, but you rarely have the opportunity to exercise that. Because the developers are the ones in control. They're ultimately the ones choreographing the built environment, right? So then when you're under one roof, you get a developer who is more focused and more thoughtful on the design, how it's impacting everything around them. I always joke that the world would be such a better place with better design. And I think that that is something that we're striving to do. And I think that in what we've built so far and what we have planned, it's evident. So I think just, having the opportunity to be the mastermind and get to do all the things that you want to do as a designer is what sets us apart.
Would you say that Alloy is a little bit more of an architecture firm than they are a developer, or would you say it's like right in the middle, 50-50?
I guess I would say it's right in the middle. Part of me, the biggest differentiation, like I've just said, that from a typical architecture firm is that we're not providing services to other people. So it is more focused on development in that aspect, but there's nothing that our architects are, we're not outsourcing anything. Like everything is in-house. We have multiple people who are licensed. So it's really like an odd happy medium. And it's kind of funny now after being here, I don't even know, it doesn't feel abnormal. It's the norm. It's what we do, and it just works. So yeah, that's a tough one. I think it's the 50-50 what makes it work.
Would there be an example, maybe something really current with something you're working on, where you can imagine how a typical developer might handle a decision versus how Alloy is handling a decision?
So I have one really big example. We have a project right now that is about to break ground. It's actually, funny enough, the site is literally right behind me. I didn't move here just because of that. But so we started it a few years ago, and it just had to go through a lot of approvals and everything. And we were supposed to break ground last spring. And then obviously we all know the pandemic hit. And so things were delayed a bit. Everything was shut down in the city, no construction at all. So we were delayed, and then we were going to break ground in the fall. So the project is going to be 42 stories. It's a big tower, rental apartments, but it was originally designed to be a commercial, 7 floors of commercial space, and then rental apartments on top of that. Obviously now with the pandemic and the way that things are looking in at least the next few years, is that office space is reducing. A lot of people are, if they're going to keep their office spaces, they're definitely going to be reducing their footprint, or just moving out completely and doing full remote work. So we had, 7 huge floors of office space, and we were at the point where we were literally ready. We had awarded trades. We were ready to break ground like within a week, and we stopped and thought about it, and we're like, we need to make a decision right now. And I think, other developers at that stage would have kept going because they're, we're already committed at this point. We just have to keep driving it home and I guess hope for the best in a few years when the project is done, and then you have to deal with absorption. But we wanted to be a little bit more proactive, and rather than shying away from readdressing it, we redesigned completely and made the whole building residential. The ground level is still retail. That's, you want some activity on the ground level, of course, in New York City where people are walking around, but the rest of it's all rental apartments. And we took the commercial aspect out completely and had to redesign. We actually added some floors in then because you didn't need the same floor heights. So rather than shying away from it, we completely redesigned, and we were able to do it quickly because we're in-house and our architects are only focused on one thing. They're not distracted with other projects. So we actually, I think it was actually October, and we had it redesigned and presented to our investors by December. So it was like a big, crackdown for all of us to just totally think about it in a different way. And, we were sad to lose some aspects of it, but I think we feel like really excited about it and think that it was actually an opportunity that we didn't see coming, and we just took it for what it was and made the most of it. So I think that is definitely something different that you wouldn't see a developer would typically do, to just completely redesign a building.
I wanted to talk a little bit about how you got to Alloy. You mentioned in a previous conversation with me that you were recruited. So if you could talk a little bit about how that process worked.
So originally I applied to a position on LinkedIn, a few months before then I was introduced to Alloy. And the recruiter for that reached out to me. She's like, look, I don't think that you're right for this position, but admittedly, I just wanted to get out of where I was. So I was just throwing things out there. So she reached out to me. She's like, I don't think you're right for this position, but let's have a conversation. So I know if I have anything for you, what you're looking for. So we got on the phone. At first I was a little bit wary because I was like, I really everyone hates that process anyway, right? So, and I was like, now I have to get on the phone with this recruiter I've never even met, okay. And we actually ended up having an hour-long conversation. Totally, we clicked. So by the end of the conversation, she's like, look, I'm going to find something for you. And then we'll know it's right. And a few weeks later, she's like, I think I got it. And just, but it was just having that conversation and being candid with someone about the thing is with a recruiter, you don't have to sell yourself the way that you feel that you do in an interview. You have to be honest, and you just have to tell them exactly what it is you're looking for, or what you're willing to compromise or not compromise. And I think just that being honest and being candid about everything, she completely understood what I wanted and where I wanted to go. And then when Alloy came up, she was like, it's perfect. And I was like, you're right, it is. And then when I met them, I was like, done deal. So yeah, I think building those relationships is important. And she's actually, it's funny, she's someone that I have still kept in touch with, and I will be making sure to send her this video too. So
I'm curious about how your background in architecture has played out in this role. Would you say do you still lean on that in your current day to day? I know a lot of what you do is lead on the construction side, but I'm very curious, like, how does that play out? Is there a feedback loop that you can provide as well into the design process? Like, how engaged are you in that part of the conversation?
Yeah, so I feel like that was, I guess, kind of two questions, or can go in two ways. But I would say in general, even if I'm not the one doing sketches or drawings, it's something that's just still a part of you and the way that you look at things. So I would say in general, throughout construction, I was always the one that was pulled into the, I guess, more detailed projects or the more intricate high-end projects because I cared. I didn't want to lose the design intent. So I would make sure I found ways just by, like the subcontractors will be saying, like, we can't do this, this isn't possible. But I'm like, well, like there has to be some kind of way. Maybe it's not exactly the way that it was drawn, but there has to be another way to achieve that. So you just ask a lot of questions and you find a way to maintain that design intent with then also taking into account constructability. And I would say then, as far as where I am now, working more closely with architects again, and right in-house, who either sit right next to me or on a Zoom call, I will mention things to them as they're designing things. I'm like, did you consider this? Or, when we go to buy this out, it's going to be a little bit difficult. That takes 3 trades that you're thinking it's just one. So I speak up when I think it's appropriate or necessary. But then also having that design background and understanding, when we do go to buy it out and are scoping out trades, I make sure that they understand the details. So they know what they're buying and they know what they're supposed to be building. And if they have, if they see an issue with it, I want to make sure that we address it up front, even like before we get to the point that we're in the field doing it. I would rather address it now and we can prepare for it and make any adjustments that we need to make. The earlier, the better.
Al, you mentioned in the past in a conversation with me about one way to sort of talk about the difference, like the new skill set of a construction management skill set and cost estimating skill set, is when you're looking at a detail, it's evaluating the sequence of and how many different trades, right? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I guess that touches on what I was just saying too. Like when you look at a detail, I'm going to use just a silly example of we have a facade detail that then there's like an inboard insulation and back pan, and then drywall goes behind it. And it's like, well, who owns that? Like the facade installer doesn't want to do the installation, but you have the extrusion that goes out to it. And then we need the back pan, it all needs to meet the performance tests. And so why would that be by the drywall guy? And then it goes both ways. So it's things like that that you just don't think about, or it's kind of then marking up a detail. Well, he owns this, this, and that, and she owns this and that part of it. And it's crazy how when you break it down to those small things, it is 2 different hands that have to touch it. Sometimes there's, like what I was saying, sometimes there's a better way to do it. How can we simplify this so it's only one group of people rather than 2 that have to coordinate, because coordination always brings up other challenges. So it could just be different things like that you don't think about come into play. And also with like estimating the cost for it, because different trades have different rates, and even their supplying of things just is factored differently for them. So diving into that more and breaking into that with each trade is invaluable.
Is there an analogy to that with real estate, where it's like, what changes about how you think about situations in architecture once you have this real estate skill set? Is there like an immediate analogy that has to do with like many hands complicates the situation, or is there something else that you'd say is like really top of mind?
I would say it's a little bit different. The first thing that comes to my mind with the way that I guess real estate has changed my focus on design is just what's important and worth the value. And that can go either way. As a designer, you may think that some of these things like you can't live without. But then as a real estate developer, the one that ultimately has to also think about the money, it's okay, like what's a nice to have and what's a has to have. And you just think about it so differently. And then when you do see the cost of things, it changes your mindset of it and what you want to include in your design, or you see the value that it has then on the absorption. If your units are selling and you're hearing over and over again that it's because of this feature, then you see even that, okay, so that was a lot of money, but it's worth it because we sold all of our units. So you do think about it just changes the way you think about things, either things that you don't want to spend your money on or things that you do want to spend your money on. If that makes sense, if that answers your question.
For kind of like the layperson, a lesson you hear about real estate is location is everything. Is that true from your perspective? How much goes into the site selection, and then what other gains? What are like the big gains that you also see that design brings to a project beyond location?
Okay, so yes, location is huge, but I would say that the key is realizing the potential in a location that other people might overlook. And I do think that's where having that innate creativity of designers comes into play. You look at this, you look anywhere. I do it every time I travel to a new city. I'm always finding, I'm like, oh, that could be this, that could be so great as that. So then obviously as a developer, you have the potential to do that, because the architect is I would say they're a little bit more visionary, and that bringing that to the table of real estate is it's a huge tool, or a secret weapon, I guess we can say. But so I would say location is hugely important, but if you see the hidden value in a location, that's even better. You can't just be well, that's the most obvious spot on the street. You can't always have that. It's going to cost you. So how could you be more creative about it and make that location something more than what it seems on paper to people? And then I would also say another big thing that we do at Alloy and can make a big difference is also just site activation before you start a project, is bringing some more life there in small ways, such as what we're going to be doing on an upcoming project is making a colorful construction fence around it rather than the typical ugly green construction fence you see, and making a little mini plaza with a painted ground, and also get some community groups to come and do performances. So just also bringing more attention to it is gonna help with the ROI.
On that front, thinking a little bit back to what you were saying about how there's probably certain elements that you might have spent more money into a project. I think about sometimes the most expensive areas of a living, in housing, it's the kitchen or something like that, or the bathrooms or whatnot. Knowing what, how does the team, is there any research that goes into what kind of things are people looking for that will make that kind of impact? And is that upstream of what design does? So in other words, is it maybe this is also an organizational question, which is how does a project evolve through the different teams, such that by the time it gets to the architect, maybe there's already a lot of context, or let's say the design team, there's already a lot of context as to okay, these are the things, this is what people are looking for in this project. How does that play out?
Yeah, so I would say it starts with as a developer, you have to define your target market. And that comes from doing a lot of market research on the area and what's selling. So we do a lot of that. We have some in-house marketing and sales people, but we do reach out to other services to give us some more insight on that front. So that way we do know what's more high in demand and what is selling. So we do definitely get other perspectives on that. And then we've had meetings where we go over different things like that what's selling, what's not selling, I would say. And then our designers might have to make some adjustments based off of that. But I would say something that's recently come up that I've seen that come into play is just designing amenities, and how much importance that has and what types of amenities to include. So we definitely do factor that into everything. There's certain amenity spaces that we wouldn't have added because we didn't know that it was something that people wanted as much. But doing that research and digging into that, we're designing for it now. And that's also a good example of something that you can't put a dollar value on exactly, but it's, if the units are sold and then you know that and there's another building next to you that's not, then you know that was a factor. And so you have to kind of just keep that trust in your future designs too.
Without a client as a stakeholder and instead an investor, what is the difference? Are there other stakeholders that you see beyond the client?
There's a ton of stakeholders because the thing is, we don't just, as a developer, you don't just come into a city, a community, a neighborhood and just say, here's what we're building, deal with it. Some developers may do that, but we're not going to do that. So the whole community is a stakeholder in a way. I think leading up to projects, there's a lot of community outreach to know what do they want in the area or what are they okay with. We actually did also do some redesign on this upcoming project based on community input. They originally were, so the area that we're in, which is right around me, there's a mix of some very tall buildings and then brownstones 1 block away. And so they were originally taken aback by the height of the tower that we designed and proposed. So we scaled it back because they're a stakeholder. They're the people living here, and we don't want to drive them out. We want them to be a part of it and we want them to be happy with it. So even though they're not a client that has to dictate everything, to us in that sense, they're a stakeholder and it's important. The same goes for, and then our investors are obviously stakeholders, but they also, they don't design the building. They also lean on us for that expertise, obviously. And they're our partners too. So it's not the client in the way that you have to answer to them in the way that's, the typical way that you perceive that. They're our partners and they want to help us succeed. So they're on board as long as, if we have to justify something, we justify a decision that we're making. So there's definitely a lot of stakeholders in the project. It's just in a different aspect, and you just have to be aware of all of that as much as you can.
Yeah, before the call, you also mentioned how buyers of what you're building are also an ongoing stakeholder, not just like a one and done stakeholder.
Yeah, so I would say that we have had buyers then, even if they're, it's like we were saying, it's rare to have a repeat buyer for a condo because I don't know how many people are buying a bunch of condos in New York City, but they have kind of recruited friends to come into our buildings as well because they were pleased with the product that they purchased. So even though it's not the same sense of repeat clients, they're bringing in more people to share that opportunity. And also, other than just buyers, there are other, quote, repeat clients, you can say, just because we're dealing with community board members and lobbyists and investors can be on multiple projects too. So it's just a different way of thinking about it.
I think there's probably a lot of people in the audience that are just even curious about what it means. Like if they work at a traditional architecture firm, they're probably just even super curious, like, how does one even become a developer? Like what, because I think there's always that question, right? About the narrative of agency within architecture firms that, you're always sort of beholden to the client and like, you can't really exercise. But the reality is like there are ways in which a firm can become a developer. And really a lot of that has to do with how you manage. Well, I guess there's different ways, right? There's actually even like as an architect, you can also like do all the due diligence, all the development of the project speculatively in a way, right? And then find investors for it. Can you maybe speak a little bit about and maybe demystify a little bit of the process of like what, not necessarily what the formula is for Aloy, but just, what does it take, right? Like what is actually the work involved to take a project from like an idea to actual execution? So
I would say one of the more important things that before jumping into developing your own projects, I would either on my own or actually take a class just to do some pro formas. I think, because here's the thing, you could go like I want to say, like, you could just go buy a property and just develop it, but you most likely are going to need someone to also give you some money for it. So how are you going to sell them that idea? Well, architects do have that one up on other developers where they can, draw up a nice, beautiful design and sell them on the design. But you also have to sell them on the fact that they're going to get their money back and then some. So if you can get the ability to do a quick conceptual feasibility designs and studies, and also show at least a back of the envelope pro forma, like, that is first and foremost. And you should do that on your own, practicing. Like, find a site around you that interests you and do some of the due diligence. Look into the zoning laws, like, for your locality, what permits are required, and see what you could actually build there, and just do some quick studies for yourself. It's honestly really fun. So I would say start there. And then if you honestly just start walking around and seeing the different areas around you and sites, like, you're going to end up stumbling upon, like I said, it's finding those hidden gem of location. And you might find that, obviously, if you're going to actually do it, start really small. Because there's a ton that you can't teach in a book, is the unfortunate thing. I wish that you could. I mean, I went to university for real estate development. Like, I got my graduate degree in that, but, like, again, it's learning a lot of the pro formas and the financials. It's not you're never going to learn the boots on the ground thing until you actually are doing it. But I would say 100% practice, and you'll end up getting sucked into it and keep doing it. And then one time you're going to do it and be like, holy crap, this is something, this is an opportunity. And then you have to sell it.
Yeah. I mean, you bring up a lot of great points about, like, that there's already just the ability to communicate the project visually. I mean, that's such a big part of just, like, even gathering investors on board, right? Because oftentimes, yes, you can just pitch it through a pro forma itself, but being able to actually understand what this is going to look like is a key ingredient to being able to actually raise money.
Absolutely. I mean, most people are not able to envision things that are not actually there.
Right.
As architects, we all have that ability to do that. But so if you can show someone that, it's hugely helpful.
Yeah.
So.
And especially, like, if you're like a traditional firm that does, let's say, residential work, that's a really good opportunity to, like, look for a single family house, or maybe even a multifamily house in your community that looks like, what they say, like, try to find the worst house on the best block type of thing, as a place to start. But, like, that exercise of building a pro forma, I'm sure one of the other benefits is ultimately that now you can speak to clients differently as well. I always think that there's, like, this idea that, like, the more you understand what happens upstream and downstream, it's only to your benefit. Ultimately, like, it helps you communicate more effectively, and it helps you to think about and anticipate the problems that someone like a developer, if you're not structured already as a lawyer is. But it's just like it seems like almost like a no-brainer, and almost like it's unfortunate that piece is somewhat missing from even education, right, for architects, because it's like, once you know that, it just makes you see products completely differently.
Yeah. I would say this is, like, kind of a little bit on a tangent, but I would say too that a good way to even get started, like, on a very, very small scale, almost like independently, would be to find somewhere that you could build a duplex and sell it or rent it out, because then you're going through all the steps, and then, you're renting it out and you still own it, or you're selling each unit. But I think that is an interesting and an easy way to get started. And then, you have something to go off of, and you have experience, and it just teaches you a lot, because then it's not just one single family home. How do you split into I think it's a little bit more than just doing one home. And because most people aren't going to just build a home and then, like, sell it. So I think doing a duplex, so you have a little bit more, you can get some more income, or you can even live in part of it and rent out.
House hack it. Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Yeah, so I just think that could be an interesting way. It's just something that I still consider, or I still would love to do at some point. So
what's great about this ultimately is that, we're talking about, like, just getting started, but you can go from there to where you are at right now, to the scale of products you're doing. I mean, it might seem sort of like a big leap, but essentially what you're suggesting ultimately is like it's the repetition of like understanding the going to due diligence, like going through that end to end. That's the important part, that you can then, just find bigger acquisition targets, because ultimately the same amount of time that it takes you to develop that duplex would probably take you to develop something larger, right? That has a better financial model associated with it, or more diversified.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really good kind of takeaway for people. I also probably suspect that many people think about the financial part of it, right? Like when we're talking about investors here for a project at the scale that you're developing, that's very different from like the scale of investors that you might find for like a smaller. I mean, a lot of it's like going to the bank. I mean, the bank is still part of what you're doing probably for developing these projects as well. But I think and it might be interesting maybe for you to explain a little bit too about like what investors mean, like the kind of gamut of them, because they actually, I mean, there's on the equity side, but there's a debt side too. If people aren't very much aware of what it means to fundraise, they might just suspect that like, oh, this is impossible. Like, how can I get like millions of dollars for a project? But in reality, it's like, well, there are people out there that are looking to invest, and there are different types of people at different scales, right? And so I think for many people, I think the idea of being a developer also seems elusive because of the fact that they're like, oh, but I don't have that kind of money. But in reality, there are people that do all the kind of due diligence work and are able to find the investors through very different types of networks that exist. But so, and my question is ultimately like, if maybe you could unpack a little bit for us, like what does that look like from when you're fundraising for a project, and how much of it is like you don't have to go into details about how you structure a deal, but I'm just curious, like what are the types of investors, and how are those like personal relationships that are built over time?
I mean, it's definitely a lot about personal relationships that are built over time, but everyone has to start somewhere. So I would say like getting started, it is unfortunately going to be kind of like the salesman knocking on people's doors. And it is just going to be a lot of word of mouth or asking people, and you'd actually be surprised. Like, and the thing is too, like, you don't have to have everyone investing a huge sum of money. It could be multiple different investors, and then they have, I don't want to get too complicated, but they have different return criteria that they want on a project. But, like there could be people who are willing to put their money into things. I mean, think about how many people put their money into stocks. You have no idea what's going to happen with that. Real estate is pretty, I don't want to say certain, nothing is, but it's fairly safe place to put your money. It just takes longer to get that back. So people are actually more willing to do it than you think. Obviously you have to start small, but then once you do one successful project, then they're going to want to invest with you again. And then you also then have something to show other people, a new investor. Well, we just did this, or they will tell people. So it just has to grow, and you have to start small unless you already, have an amazing network of investors that are willing to, put their pennies into your basket. But I would say, even if you know a ton of investors up front, you can't just think that they're going to put their money into you. Like I said, you have to sell it, and you have to show them what you're going to do. And like I said, most people other than this world are not that imaginative. So you need to show them, you need to sell it to them. But everyone wants to invest their money. Everyone wants something. You got to do something with it.
Ali, I wanted to ask you if Alloy follows the like 5 phases of architecture. We're kind of talking about like early stages of trying to work as a developer. But when you're working at the level that Alloy is, where it's more structured, there's more people on the team, is there phasing that's going on in what you might describe as like the development process versus the architecture process? And then is there also phasing going on sort of in parallel that you're seeing on the construction management and contracting side?
So I would say, obviously, those 5 phases can never go away. So we have those, and just adding a couple other phases onto the front end and then a couple onto the back end. So obviously, earlier in the process is, I'll call it a feasibility phase, where that involves the site selection, due diligence, underwriting, feasibility study. And our architects actually do come into play with that, rather than just being like, okay, well, we're allowed to build a 3-story building here. Our architects will actually do a little, like some quick sketches on it and give us a little bit more, like give it a little more taste and because of what is around them in that, or what's around that neighborhood. Like different materials too, like it could, but we definitely look into a little bit more of the design than I think most developers would at that stage. But you definitely have that, like I said, we'll call it the feasibility stage where you're doing all of that. And then obviously that also comes with program development that architects, I guess, wouldn't typically, in some cases, the architect is brought on board very early in the process, but for the most part, you're not deciding what the program is. Someone is coming to you once that's already chosen and they say, we're building a commercial space and this is what we want, design it. So you're part of that program development too, and like the very early conceptual designs. And then obviously once that's all done, and then you hit the typical 5 stages. And then you're also thinking about like we were talking about, even if we don't manage buildings, we're still thinking about that next stage of absorption and selling or, leasing up. So that's something that you're typically not involved as an architect, you're typically not involved in either. And even if like our designers aren't the ones doing it, then we're all in, we have an open office, like we're all in one room, we're all talking about it. Everything is, there's no secret. So they're just more aware of it. And I think it just makes you think differently overall, just hearing the things, even if you're not the one directly involved with it, all the different steps it takes. And it just makes you understand more like how many people are involved in one building. And I would say on a parallel note for construction, I guess obviously I'm just looking at things differently. As they're picking materials and finishes, I'm then looking at what are the lead times, and well, that's not going to get here in time for construction. So I guess like it's also thinking about the actual construction schedule alongside some of these design choices and making sure that that's understood if there's any issues with that.
One thing that's really getting attached to these existing architecture processes is price. So like on program, there's like a sense of the value of program. And then maybe on, the schedule, there's, extra column of the pricing, which is maybe instead of just like general estimation on the architecture side, you especially have true ownership of that pricing. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Like the value of program that the developer sees, and then the real cost impact of the schedule that you're directly managing?
The value of program. So, I mean, the value of program, honestly, if we're talking like residential versus office space versus retail, there is dollar values you could put to that. Obviously, you just have to know the going rates in the market of your area. But there are other things that are less tangible, I guess. Like I was saying earlier with like amenity spaces, like there is still a value on there, even though you can't fully put a dollar value, there's still a value. So you're deciding that program too. Schedule also has a dollar value because there are carrying costs and interest that you're paying, and that obviously has a huge impact. So if you see there's a way that something is designed that's just going to take 3 months longer because it's more complicated, you don't want to do that. Like you want to figure out a different way to do it. So, I mean, schedule comes into huge play. I don't know if that answered your question exactly, but.
Yeah, that's really helpful too, to just understand that the time value of money. How do you model that out? Like, what is like your interface into time and money cost? Like, are you building out like a lot of different kind of like Excel models that an architect would not see?
Oh yeah. I mean, like I said, if you just start practicing a pro forma, obviously there's some basic ones that won't reflect that in there, but otherwise you should be building in like our site that we have right now. We haven't started construction, but we've owned it for a few years. We're paying for that. So you need to build that into your financial analysis. That's a huge part of it. So yeah, there's a whole aspect to that. And then once you get into the construction phase, there's things that you're like other permits that you have to maintain over a period of time that you have to factor in too. So there's a ton to it. I don't know how much you want me to get into it, but even like rental costs of like site fences, if you want security cameras, like there's a million different things. And it's not just a one-time cost, it's over time. So if things start to get delayed, it's not just, oh, well, it's 1 month of delay that you're not selling yet. No, it's actually all those other 10 things I just listed. That's another 3 months or whatever of an added expenditure that we just don't need to have. So
does it create for you like a whole lot more empathy on the client side? Seeing these, like the cost impact of time, imagining yourself in an architecture office sort of blind to that?
I see what you're saying, yes. But I would say the unfortunate thing is a lot of the times a lot of clients will come in with a misconception of the time that things do take. So when they come in with unrealistic expectations, then I'm sorry, but no, I don't have empathy. But yes, I get what you're saying. So yes, I do. I have a much more heightened awareness of that now. And, I remember just when I was just in construction previously and I was like, oh, it's just going to take a few more weeks. Like, what's the big deal? And I didn't understand why the client was so upset. I'm like, don't you want it done the right way? And even if it takes a few more weeks, and they're like, no, like and now I do get that more, but they have to have realistic expectations, but that's also, on, I guess, you as a project team to set those expectations. So two-way question there.
Yeah, I'm also just curious from that. It's like there just seems to be so much untapped value in bringing forward some of this information earlier into a process. Like I imagine like how you're framing it, right? If a client doesn't have really good, clear expectations, which in other words, if an architect doesn't also understand the implications of what they're doing, right, that could be a recipe for disaster, right? Because essentially the architect doesn't really factor into their due diligence process when bringing on a client. Like, are they aware of without that kind of information that you're bringing to the table on the construction side, that architect just doesn't have that criteria in place to be able to make that call and say, actually, this is not a really good client for us because there's going to be a nightmare at the end of the day with this mismatched expectations.
Yeah.
So it just kind of makes me think if there's just this great opportunity somehow for architects to figure out systems to design to include this into their own process, to learn more about, or either through education or through partners, very early on, when even trying to have a conversation with a potential client as to like, is this the right client to bring on?
Yeah.
Period.
So that just kind of like triggered another thought in me. I was going to say one of the most important things that I would do if I was still an architect is go to your project sites as much as possible. I know that like we all kind of like get in our silo of what we should be working on, and it's inconvenient to drive or to take the train and go there, but go to your construction site and don't just go there and walk around by yourself and look at it. Talk to the construction manager and form a relationship with them, and you will both learn from each other and benefit greatly from that. I cannot express that enough, but coming from an architecture background and being on a construction site daily was just completely game changing. But I think it works both ways because the construction manager also needs to learn from the architect. I really think it's just working together. And the unfortunate thing is that, most architects in say bigger companies, you're working on like 5 different projects at a time. So you're not going to have the luxury of being aware of all these things that I'm mentioning and bring it to the table on every project. You don't have that time, but that's why there are people in different disciplines that all have to come together to build a building. You don't have to be an expert in every area, but it's good to get comfortable with the people that you're working with, whoever your project team is. So find ways to form that relationship. I know right now there might not be as much in-person things, but try ways to form that relationship so you're comfortable with them and you trust them, because the thing is you can't know everything and you don't have time to do everything, but feeling comfortable even to just reach out to them and text them, like it's a difference, because then they'll also, when you have something that you need from them, they'll respond to you if you forge that relationship.
I'm going to transition to some audience questions. So one that came in is, has identifying contractors and trades that are able to execute Alloy's design intent, has that been a limiting factor in the work?
Not limiting, no. I would say that from what I've seen, it actually, we find subcontractors and trades and construction managers who are excited about it, that they feel it's refreshing. They like really appreciate the design. So I don't feel that it's been limiting. It's actually been more beneficial because we get people who almost care as much as we do. I can't say they care as much because really it's like, it's like your baby, like it's our project. But it's actually, I've really enjoyed being on, like, we've had so many calls of like bidding out for different subcontractors and like how many people want to be a part of the project because they're like, and like they say specific reasons why. I'm like, oh, you're not just like BSing me, like you actually do appreciate this. So it's not limiting. I could see why that would be the thought, but I think it's the same for everyone. Like you don't want to keep building the same things over and over. And like if they have the capability and the capacity to do something different, then they're excited about it. Why not change things up a little bit? So no, I don't think it's an issue, but I don't think it's an issue. It's actually you find people who get excited about the same things that you do.
We had a question that came in. It's sort of like similar to a question you answered about how to get started in development as an architect. How might you think about that for how to get started in a GC role? Is there a way to sort of test that or?
Nope.
No.
Yeah, I wish that there was, but unfortunately there's not. But it's not a bad thing. I think if you're interested in it, you should listen. GCs always need people. You know what I mean? Like an architecture firm might be a little bit more lean, but GCs are not as much. So they're always gonna need people. You can maybe find something. I would say just jump into it, and that's the best way. Like that is something that you really just can't learn, and you learn from people around you. And the biggest thing I would say though is if say you do go into that role, I think a hard thing for a lot of people is communicating with the subcontractors directly on site. I think is a huge thing, and they learn you so much more than you could even imagine just by asking them questions. Don't be afraid to look like you don't know something. That's always what I have told new people. I'm like, they're the expert in their area. You're not. Like, I know enough about each trade, but I'm not an expert in every trade. But I know enough to at least know I have to ask them questions. And I've learned more and more by doing that. And they respect you and are more and more willing to help you and work with you then too. So I would say talking to all the subcontractors if you want to do it, or even, maybe if you're nervous or you don't necessarily want to make that change, then like I said, stay in your architecture role, but go to your project sites and you can still talk to the subs and to the CM, and you can just if you're there a lot, you'll gain some of that. You won't gain as much of the, I don't want to say stresses, but it's a different sense of urgency when you're the construction manager, the GC, which is, a blessing and a curse. I don't know how you want to look at it, but you won't gain that full aspect of it, but you will gain a lot still going as an architect, not as a GC. But, I think it'd be great. I think it should actually be like a new part of like getting your architectural licenses. Like you have to work for a GC for a full year. And that's one of the tests you have to take or something. But because I think that'd be great. I also think the same thing for GCs though. They should go have to work for an architecture firm for a year too.
Ali, how about say a firm owner has between 8 to 30 people. Should they consider bringing on someone with your background, like a director of construction or construction manager that either isn't exactly the GC, but actually could be the GC in some cases?
I think that it depends on how many projects that firm has going on at any given time, but I think that there's benefits to it regardless. Like it can be kind of a liaison between the two. So it could help free up some of the tasks that the architects have to do that aren't really, it's like, it's not necessarily, there's so many things that we're always like, why am I the one doing this? And so it definitely could free up some of those tasks and it could be, the person who is like intimately familiar with the design and is on site more frequently. So I think there's a ton of ways that can be integrated in, and I think it's helpful. There could also just be sessions that the team has for like constructability review, and just helps the designers look at things in a different way. Like there's so many different ways that could be useful. So I wouldn't say, I think it could be a really interesting way to bring something different to your company without making a huge change.
And maybe give you an edge too. I just think about like how that could impact like client conversations as well. Mm-hmm. You're bringing that person into the room as well as a stakeholder, as part of the conversation and the pitch, to say like, hey, we really understand what you're looking for, and we can consult you too on that, and be sure that the product we're providing or delivering is ultimately, it has all the costs associated with it, right? We understand that more effectively.
Yeah. Oh yeah. It's another thing too that I didn't mention, but certain designs is saying, well, how can we provide some savings while still designing what we want here, and different things like that. So yeah, I think there's a ton of ways that could be. I think that'd be really interesting, actually.
I mean, I just love how you described too this idea of like going on the detailed drawing and like marking out like who owns what when it actually comes to putting it together. Yeah. And that, what might seem like a very unified detail is actually like this kind of like really unbeknownst to the architect, just so many different people actually. And not even, it's like the diagram, maybe because I'm reverting back to my old days of studying architecture, but the diagram that you could draw for that could be pretty interesting. Just like, there's time as an equation, because like this trade actually wouldn't even pop out that part, or like whatever, right? It's just, the complexity there, I think, would be incredibly valuable to decipher upfront, and to your point, educate too. I think that alone seems worth the position.
Yeah. I think helping with trade coordination and sequencing would be really interesting for the architects to kind of get more of a feel for.
How about on site, like going on site and sort of having the foresight to know maybe the contractor or the trades don't see where a built condition they've just created is going to create a consequence later?
I don't know if I'm misunderstanding, but I would say, like, I haven't come up with a situation where the trade isn't already aware if there's going to be a future consequence. They will, hopefully they will address it before they actually then complete part of it. Or it might be in the middle, unfortunately. They'll start to do something and they'll be like, that's not going to work that way. Or especially if you're working in an existing building, there's going to be millions of things like that. But it's usually either before or in the middle of something. So, but then obviously you just have to make changes on the fly.
Well, I think we're almost at the top of the hour. So I just want to ask one final question that I like to ask all our guests. And that is, what is the nicest thing anyone's ever done for you? It's very different from types of questions we've been asking, but we like to also kind of zoom out and just talk about being people for a minute.
So I'm going to have to be really nerdy right now. So the first thing that comes to my mind is I'm like, well, my mom is the nicest person I know. So it has to be something she's done for me, right? But then I'm like, how do you ever even remember a specific thing your mom has done for you? Like, they do everything. But I will say, and it might not be, I don't know if you would say it's the nicest or sweetest thing, but every Mother's Day, she gives my sister and I a gift. And it could be something small, or it could just be a card one year. But she gives us a little gift every Mother's Day because she says, I wouldn't be a mother without you. And I think that is just the sweetest thing.
So sweet. So sweet.
So that's the first thing that comes to my mind.
And very timely too, because Mother's Day is coming up.
I know.
So that's a good reminder for folks. Yeah. That's amazing. Thank you so much. Well, before we all leave, I just want to take a moment to give a little blurb about Monograph, the company that is hosting this webinar and that Chris and I work at. So At Monograph, we're building the future of practice operations and back office management for small to medium-sized firms. Monograph is designed for architects by architects, firm owners, operation leaders, office admins, project managers, all use Monograph to track the fee health of a project and staffing across projects as well. So if you're very interested in starting with Monograph and checking us out, feel free to go over to monograph.io, or you can also sign up for a live demo, which we have. If you go to Monograph, you'll be able to see it there, a button at the very top right. You can sign up for a live demo that we host every Friday. So you can watch Robert, our CEO, and myself kind of talk to you about the benefits of Monograph and give you a walkthrough. So feel free to join. Ali, thank you so much for this kind of this really amazing walkthrough. I took away so much inspiration from that, from this conversation. Thank you so much for your time. And for
Thank you guys. This was very fun.
Thank you, Ali. Really appreciate it.
Cheers, everyone.